The date is October 30th, 2003. We're back with Tom Theobald to watch as he refines beeswax in preparation for candle dipping later this fall. This refining takes place in this building, which is what Tom calls his honey house, and it's located on the grounds of the Left-Hand Valley Tree Nursery on 81st Street, which is northwest of Niwot.
We're in what was at one time the milk house on the Bader homestead, and Harlan Henderson discovered this about 3 years before I appeared on the scene. The farm had been sold and it was in the hands of Pavlakis, the development company, and the milk house hadn't been used for many, many years. Harlan did the initial cleaning, and little did I suspect in 1975 when I opened that door that I was going to spend the rest of my life here, but here I am 28 years later. And this serves as the honey house for the candle making and for the honey harvesting, and at off times of the year as a warehouse. So it's a multiple purpose building, and it's sort of command central for the Niwot Honey Farm. What we're doing today is we're doing the second refining of the beeswax in preparation for candle making. And I can show you a little later the stages that we've gone through. Candles, properly done candles, are a very delicately balanced mechanism, and when we get to the dipping I'll explain it a little further, but one of the requirements is very pure wax. There shouldn't be any impurities at all in the wax, or it will tend to clog the wick and create burning problems of various kinds. So what we do is I take a block of wax. This has gone through the first stage of refining, and this is just a block of raw beeswax, and for most purposes that means it's time to check the temperature on the beeswax. For most purposes this would be fine for most uses, but for the candle making it has to go through an additional step. So I chunk it up and I put it in this pot right here, which has about an inch or two of water in the bottom, so it's liquefied over the water. It takes about 3 hours to fill that tub, and that's beeswax. Now, even though that chunk looks pretty pure, that stuff on the top is called slum gum, and those are the impurities that were in the beeswax, or some of the impurities. The impurities will do one of two things. They'll either float or they'll sink. The ones that sink will drop to the margin between the wax and the water. The ones that float now I'm going to skim off, and they'll be discarded. They're of no value. So I'm ready to start the skimming right now. Let's see here. Just a piece of window screen is all we use. This is a Rube Goldberg technology. It's pretty simple.
fashion those pots yourself, or are they a commercial?
When I started out, I used square 5-gallon cans that were for years used in the honey business for honey. They were called 60s. They hold 60 pounds of honey. And I cut the top out and soldered a spout into them. But these I bought the pots and I made the adjustments that I needed for the wax refining, and these are just a little more dependable and sophisticated and safer. And
you mentioned that for most purposes that block of wax that you showed us was sufficient. Now, who would use a block that still had impurities in it?
well, if it was melted, the impurities could be separated out fairly easily, the larger impurities. If it were being used for furniture polish or floor wax or hand lotion or something like that, these impurities really aren't of any great significance.
What temperature is that wax right now?
It's at about 180 degrees. The melting point of wax is about 147. I'm going to put the thermometer in it in just a second, and we'll see where the temperature is.
Did you have a good supply of beeswax this year?
Well, I exceeded my own beeswax supply several years ago. Initially, I started doing the candles just as a diversion. I had the beeswax. I had the time in the winter. I didn't really know a whole lot about candles, but it was basically, I've always enjoyed the full moon nights. It was a good excuse for a grown man to stay up all night and howl at the moon. I'd warm things up in the afternoon, and by dusk I was ready to start dipping, and I'd dip through the night. At that time it was about a 12-hour process, and I'd finish up about dawn. And when I got tired of dipping, I could step outside and enjoy the moonlight and the peace and quiet, and the world was kind of my own. But the customers really are the ones who educated me, and I started getting requests for a few pair here and a few pair there, and it's gotten completely out of hand. There goes the leisure of my winter. Okay. That's about all the skimming that we need to do. Now let me put the thermometer in there. You're okay. Now at the same time that I've been liquefying the beeswax, I've been heating an equal volume of water. And that's what this top pot is. That's water. And the refinement of the beeswax is basically a flotation process. So when the wax has cooled down to the point where I want to begin to run it, then I'll put a hose on this spout on the upper tank, which will introduce the water down at the bottom of the lower tank. I try to keep the temperatures fairly closely balanced so that we don't get any convection or turbulence and stir up anything that might be at the margin of the wax in the water. Wax is lighter than water, so as you introduce the water, it raises the level. The wax will come out this spot, and it'll go through a final filter, which is nylon from pantyhose. I go through several pairs of pantyhose when I'm refining the wax, and I get some real strange looks at the grocery store sometime when I show up at the checkout counter with 5 pair of giant pantyhose. And that'll get any of the really fine little critters that I missed with the window screen. Usually not too many, but that's the final filtering. So it's at about 175. I'll let it drop to about 170, and then we'll start to run. Now I'm just tipping it forward a little, because when I've finished running off the wax, I'll tip it backward. There's going to be a thin layer of beeswax at the top, and what I want is I want that to drop below the spout. So by tipping it backwards, now it's below the spout. When I come over this afternoon, I can just pop that out, and I've got a little disc of wax, and it goes back in the next run. That enables me to go from one pan to another alone. I can't stop the flow, so when I pull the top pan out, it goes down into the bottom pan, and I just keep switching back and forth. Let's see. You might want to get this. I'm going to put the filter in.
Yeah. You going to do that now?
Mm-hmm.
Should we be filming now? Oh, I'm on.
This is more of the high technology. And that's a ring that you use for needlepoint or darning, or just holds the nylon. We've got a little more time to wait. A lot of these things have a kind of personal significance. Like the hammer that I use for breaking up the wax belonged to Ruby Roney. Did you know Ruby?
I didn't know her.
First thing, I have to warm this up a little. This is the tube that I'm going to use to introduce the water. If I just stick that cold tube down into the hot wax, the wax will plug it. So I have to preheat it before I put it in. Excuse me just a minute. Then when I put it down in the wax, I put my thumb over it so that it keeps the wax from running up into the tube, into the hose. down to the water level, then when I take my thumb off, then it's the water that's going to run up into it. And we warm the filter a little.
During part of that. So,
Okay.
Start up at the,
Turning dross into gold. You have to be really careful with the beeswax. You don't want it to go anywhere that you don't want it to go, because it will weld itself to whatever it touches as it cools. So you have to be careful you don't spill it.
Is there anything you can use to get it up, or you just out of luck?
You know, you could use the hair dryer and liquefy it. And I haven't had any spills, fortunately.
Tom, can you buy these pans commercially, these kettles?
Well, you can buy the kettles. These are just stock pots. But I've never seen any that are made commercially for doing this kind of refining.
Is there no market for it?
Well, there are beekeepers who make candles. I think they probably make their own equipment. There's apparently not a sufficient market to warrant anyone manufacturing this kind of equipment.
So then a lot of candles must be made with the impurities in them?
Minor impurities, yeah. And most of those would either settle to the bottom of the dip tank or rise to the top where they could be skimmed off. I really am pretty much of a purist when it comes to the refining of the beeswax. The challenge is to produce a dripless candle. And we can talk a little bit more about that when I get to the dipping part, but it's a much more complicated problem than you would imagine. It's not just a question of taking some string and putting some wax on it and calling it a candle, which you can certainly do, and a lot of people do that, but to get a dripless candle is a little more of a challenge, particularly with a natural substance like beeswax. I'll get about 6 of those. About 22 pounds of wax from a run.
How many more runs will you do this season?
Oh boy. Divide 300 by 20 and that'll give you a pretty good idea.
And this is what, over here is what you'll be using for melting down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I want to give a shot.
We can show that once I've run the wax. I'll set out the different steps. One of the reasons for the plastic is in the event of a spill. When it cools on the plastic, you can just flex the plastic and it'll pop right off. We're going to use a little gizmo that Mark Barron made for me. Mark is a neighbor and a friend and a beekeeper, and as we get to the margin between the wax and the water, which is at the end here, you can usually see it, but if the wax is not opaque, can't see through, this little gizmo will sense when we get to that margin, it'll sense the resistance, the change in resistance from beeswax to water, and set off a little alarm. So we're going to try it. And this wax is quite clear so I could see the margin, but we'll try it. you can't really see through it as well, so this comes in real handy.
Is there a name for his invention?
No. No, we haven't named it.
Or patented it? What would you call it?
I don't know. Let's see here. What are we going to do? Nope. Well, I'm just going to set this on. Now you see, take a look, you can see the margin. You can see the texture. See a dark spot there and there? That's where the water's showing through.
Explain again exactly how this little invention is going to detect when the layer of wax is...
It measures the resistance, the electrical resistance of the wax versus the water, and those little terminals are spaced just such that when it reaches the water will conduct the electricity much more readily than the wax will, and it sets off the buzzer. But it's not working. I didn't get it hot enough, and the wax congealed on it. But here's what it sounds like. Okay. Now. See it cooling? Oop.
How long will it take these pans of wax to completely solidify?
Oh, I'll come back over about 4 or 5, and they'll be ready to remove probably by then, or I could just leave them overnight. Actually, beeswax holds the heat quite long. It takes quite a while for it to cool. The wax congeals and disrupts the whole thing. One little design flaw that we need to work on. Will cool to just a little disc of wax. The wax shrinks as it cools, and I'll just be able to lift that out and it'll go into the next run. But you can see some of the slum gum that was on the bottom. The beeswax is a byproduct of the honey harvest, and we'll get about 2 to 3 pounds of beeswax per 100 pounds of honey that we harvest. And this is called cappings wax. It's the caps that are cut from the comb so that the cells are open again so that the honey can be removed. The cappings fall into a machine called a capping spinner, which is essentially like a washing machine with just a spin cycle. Has an inner basket, and that will spin most of the honey out of those cappings, the honey that's been cut away with the cappings. And this is the result. These are the cappings. Kind of like oatmeal. Still sticky, but fairly dry. Then those go through a melting process, and the end result of that is a block that looks like this. And for most purposes, this block would be usable for hand lotion or polish or the variety of other uses that beeswax is put to. But for candles, you really need very fine, pure wax. So it goes through the flotation process that we've just covered and is run off into cake pans, and this is the result. And these then will be melted down again, and these will be used for the candle dipping. In order to melt the wax, either for refining or for candle making, you can't put one of these big blocks into the dip tank or the melting tank, and it'll melt faster if you can break it up into smaller blocks. So I'll take the result of the initial refining, and that'll get chopped up into blocks and into pieces, and I use a chisel, but basically a cold chisel. But when you do that, the beeswax tends to shatter a little bit, and it'll shoot pieces of beeswax all over the honey house, which is no great tragedy, but it makes a mess and has to be cleaned up, and you've lost those little bits of wax. And so I thought for a long time that I needed some sort of splash guard. And this is my Frusenglage splash guard. And this fits over the chisel head and down on the wax so that when I tap it with the hammer, it catches the bits and keeps them from leaving the container. And I haven't seen these manufactured anywhere either.